All right, we are on to Hermes. Another one of these gods that I know my sense kind of it finds his way into the kind of top five most popular deities, both from an ancient and possibly from a modern point of view as well. A very quick-moving, quick-witted, young, youthful, energetic deity who just by the kind of the dint of his personality, he finds his way into lots of different stories. And like Apollo, like Athena, like a lot of these gods, he has a number of associations that place him in many different scenarios across kind of the Greek theological spectrum. Of course, he's probably best known as the messenger deity. He's one of the more easily recognizable gods. He's kind of one of these usually eternally youthful. He's usually depicted as a teenager, although we will see him in a kind of an older bearded form as well. Wings on his hat, wings and snakes on his staff, wings on his sandals. The wings, of course, implying his quick mobility, his role as coming down from Olympus to the mortal realm, acting as the mouthpiece of Zeus. So remember in Odyssey, we see him early on coming down to Calypso to tell her that she's got to let Odysseus go. So it's a classic example of his role as the messenger god. But he has lots of these other associations too, which to my mind are just as interesting and fascinating, if not much more. He's a god of thieves, in that thieves that represent kind of that Metis kind of cunningness, trickery, the crafty, the clever thief, the smart thief. Not your everyday pickpocket, but the kind of cleverness that that Odysseus represents. Those figures that kind of stand in that gray area between legal and illegal. He's a god, as we'll see, as a god of travel, a protector of boundaries. In fact, he may, in some of his earliest guises, may have arisen as a god, as a protector of those outside places and those boundaries between nature and civilization, the wild and the not wild, that we know that the Greeks had lots of anxiety about in their own theology. He's a guide of souls. He's the one of his roles as a messenger god, of course, is that he can travel between planes of existence very, very easily, and so it makes sense then that that role would be extended to the hereafter. And so he played a funerary role, in that he would guide souls down into the underworld. We've already seen a couple of examples of this along the ways. Yeah, he's a trickster god. He plays that most cultures that have a body of folklore that we can access and read or hear about. The trickster character is a very common archetype. Odysseus is a trickster character. Hermes is, again, that quick wit, that quick mind, a quick sense of humor that often is a hallmark of the trickster deity. He also later becomes a god of gain, of financial gain, that is, commerce. The Romans, in particular, worshipped and recognized Hermes along these lines much more than the Greeks did, and we'll take a brief look at that towards the end of this presentation. Magic, too. The practice of magic relied upon in the ancient Greek mind. I guess you find this all around the world too, historically speaking. How do you conduct magic? Well, you have to tap into that next realm, that divine realm. You have to tap into that power temporarily to enact your spell, or however you want to think of it or describe it. And so Hermes is one of these figures that traffics between this world and the divine world. He's a god that can help you tap into that power, and he can provide that link between here and the next world, or the divine realm. All right, his birth story, it was a favorite of the ancient Greeks. The most commonly held story is that he's a son of Zeus, the product, again, of one of Zeus's many affairs, here with a minor deity by the name of Maia. But his birth story immortalized in the famous Homeric hymn to Hermes, which I believe our course text reproduces almost in its entirety. It's a long story, but it basically tells the first 24 hours of Hermes' life, where he's born, and within that first day, he has stolen Apollo's cattle. He's invented cooking. He's invented music, and he's this naughty little boy, but he's also very clever. He hits the ground absolutely running, and it's full of wit and wisdom and mirth and you can see in that story why the ancient Greeks loved Hermes so much. So attend to that story carefully in the course textbook. It's one of the great ones. Um, it's likely, like I said in the first slide, that Hermes had his origin as a kind of god of the outlands, of boundaries, or of the boundless places. There's evidence that he began his life as a god, in as much as we can measure these things, in this area of southern Greece, kind of right in the dead center of what we call the Peloponnesus, the southern peninsula of mainland Greece, called Arcadia. And Arcadia, you'll still hear that term as kind of if a place is described as Arcadian, it's like almost like a Garden of Eden like quality. Pure nature, lush gardens, an untrammeled forest, that kind of place. And so Arcadia, certainly this area of Greece in antiquity, and even today, is one of kind of rocky, mountainous, sylvan beauty, olive groves. Even today, in this part of Greece, very few people live. It's not a place where you would easily build a city, but it's a place where if there are people, it's olive farmers and shepherds. And so it's a kind of a place of pure nature. And so Hermes may have had his origin as kind of a god of the wild. He's sometimes connected to the god Pan, this kind of wild, half goat, half humanoid deity who dwells deep in the woods. There is a connection between Hermes and Pan, and it may stem from this shared origin. Now, one of the aspects of Hermes' identity that you don't get in the kids' books about Hermes is this part of this aspect of Hermes as a boundary deity. One of these archaeological pieces connected to Hermes that have been found in multiple examples, I show you just a couple here, are these statues which are we call Hermes. And they're all a little bit different, but they usually share similar qualities. Kind of a high, kind of rectangular stone pillar. You have the head of the god Hermes at the top of it. Sometimes he's a beardless youth. Sometimes he's a bearded, older version of the deity. And then on the front, as you can clearly see, it's broken here, but a representation of male genitalia. And here, not just genitalia, but erect genitalia. And this is, I think it's one of these things that, when it is encountered, is often broadly misunderstood and misinterpreted. Usually, and for good reason, when we here in the Western world, here in the 21st century, we see an image like this, we immediately think of, it's sexual. It has to do with fertility, perhaps, or if you want to push it to the edge, it's kind of a pornographic symbol. And this is not to deny, kind of connections to fertility or sex that a symbol like this would have had to the ancients. I think it's misleading to say that that's the key aspect of this symbol. So what's going on here? Again, to the Western modern eye, it looks so weird. It looks comical, and it bears explaining. But this is one of the early forms of Hermes that shows up archaeologically speaking. Kind of outside of the myths. It gets us into an area of how the Greeks thought about the god, how they worshipped the god, the function that the god played in their society. So where would the ancients have put these weird pillars? Well, we know that they put them at like the gates of a city, at maybe the edge of one's property, near the threshold of one's house, or outside the city. You might find them at a crossroads where two or more roads meet. And the thing that all of those things have in common, gateways, thresholds, crossroads, is that they are, in the kind of the ancient kind of superstitious mind, they are boundless places or boundaryless places. That is, the threshold of a house, it's not the inside of the house, it's not the outside of the house. It's both, it's neither. The gateway to a city, it's not in the city, it's not outside the city, it's both, it's neither. Where two roads meet, it's both road A and road B, but it's also neither. And so we know that the Greeks, and this is a very common thing, this is not just a Greek thing, you find this in cultures around the world. I would even argue we still have it in our culture, but we bury it under we bury it in narratives, and we bury it under kind of a kind of an Enlightenment logic that through which we kind of deny that we have these anxieties. But that's the subject of another a whole other lecture. But the idea is that I alluded to this when we were talking about Artemis in a previous lecture, is that these unbounded places in the ancient mind um, was believed that that's where unbounded spirits, dangerous spirits, would congregate. It was the only place that they would kind of find a home. So a spirit of someone who was buried, or who died, I should say, was unburied, didn't have the proper rituals around him, would be kind of a dangerous, restless spirit that could cause havoc and chaos in someone's life. And so the idea is that you would use this kind of imagery, this kind of aspect of the god, to protect against these kinds of things. And so you would place this, what we call a herm, at the crossroad of the threshold. Now, again, this doesn't explain what's going on with the phallus here, the genitalia. Well, you know that the Greeks, and this is also, again, this is a kind of a thing that you find around the world in ancient cultures. The idea is that symbols like this didn't necessarily express kind of fertility or sexuality primarily. What for the ancient Greeks was this idea that imagery that reflected the obscene, that is, an erect penis here, which is something that ought to be in polite, civilized society kept, behind closed doors, covered up. This idea that the obscene had the effect of scaring off, of warding off these evil spirits. So you would put, and Hermes is probably the best example of this, but you find other examples of this as well, of phallic imagery, sexual imagery, placed at strategic places around a city. And like I said, to the modern eye, it looks sexualized, it looks pornographic, it looks comical. But to the ancient mind, that kind of obscene imagery would protect those kind of boundless, what we call liminal spaces, and scare away the evil spirits, the dangerous spirits, and keep it safe for civilizations. So one of the theories about Hermes' origins is that, again, we don't have really solid proof of this, but that his name, Hermes, seems to be related to a Greek word herma, which just means a pile of stones. And so one of the theories is, and I find this a very attractive theory, is that, imagine a traveler traveling outside the city, and he comes to a crossroads, and he kind of has this built-in anxiety about that unbounded place. Like someone might toss a coin in a fountain for good luck, you might toss a stone into the center of the crossroads as a way of kind of like a little mini ritual to protect yourself against the evil spirit that might be congregating at that liminal place. And so over time, dozens, hundreds of thousands of travelers come by the same place. They do the same thing. They add a stone to the pile. And so one of the theories is that over time, that pile of stones in the center of the crossroads or at the threshold came to be personified as the god of the crossroads. And so Herma, the pile of stones, becomes Hermes. And then over time, the god develops a kind of a more humanoid persona. I mean, look at this pillar. You can almost see the pile of stones becoming kind of crafted into something more concrete, and even the head sprouting. It's becoming humanoid. We can maybe even, this might be a little much, but we can kind of see the birth of a god, so to speak. I don't know. Take it or leave it. But I think that this role is a very important one. I think to understand that kind of anxiety about liminal spaces is key to kind of understanding the way that the Greeks viewed the physical spaces of their world. Here's another one. This isn't Hermes, but it's reflective of the same thing. This is a mosaic tile that archaeologists found at the threshold of a Roman house. Maybe the Romans carried on the same kind of superstitious magic, protective magic. And this was a mosaic that protected that house from the evil eye, which is still a fairly common superstition in places, even in Italy and Greece today, and around the world. This idea that if an enemy even looks at you in a particular way, that they can bring down a curse upon you. And so you have to protect yourself with rituals, with amulets, with symbolism. And so here we have this, again, to the modern eye, it looks so strange. We have the evil eye here being attacked by a number of things: a raven, a trident, a sword, a scorpion, a snake, a dog, a centipede. Why not? Here comes a leopard. And then we have what our little legend here identifies as a phallic dwarf. So we have like a pygmy person here who is playing or preparing to play a flute, And then this here pointing behind him, that's exactly what you think it is. It's his genitalia kind of pointing in the other direction, kind of between his legs. Again, it's that erect phallus that's pointing back at the evil eye. This idea that the obscene imagery wards off kind of evil magic, or evil superstitious evil things that could tread upon your day-to-day life. All right, so as part of that, Hermes belonging to Arcadia and the god of the wild and the god of the boundless places, early depictions of Hermes also seem to suggest that he was a god of shepherds. He's a god of the wild, and so it would make sense that the people who make their living out there in the wild would see him as a protector deity. And so here we have Hermes here. Whenever you see these braids on a statue, that's indicative of a very early form of Greek statuary. But carrying the young ram, here this fragment of kind of a frieze sculpture on the side of a vase or a pot also shows him with the ram across his shoulders. So he's a protector of kind of the animals of the wild, the protector of human beings that live in those outside places. And so I think over time he shifts to becoming kind of more of a god of civilization, associated with music and cooking and heroes and the like. But his early origins, he is closer to Artemis in ways than he is to Apollo. So he's a god with a really interesting backstory that's all over the map. Some have seen that perhaps even some of those early depictions of Hermes as the shepherd god may have influenced even early Christian imagery. One of the identities of Christ is the good shepherd. And so here we have kind of a youthful, beardless Jesus with a ram across his shoulders. We probably won't have a lot of time in this class to really explore this, but one of the really interesting things that happens as Christianity starts to spread throughout the Mediterranean world and into the Roman Empire, one of the things that happens is lots of that pre-Christian Greek imagery for their gods becomes co-opted into Christian imagery. And so we might see maybe a small example of this here is that we have kind of that Hermes as the shepherd god is now kind of co-opted by early Christians when depicting Christ as the good shepherd. So like we said early on, he's a god that's very easy to recognize in art, and while there are slight variations, it's pretty consistent. He'll sometimes wear this broad brimmed hat you see up here without the wings. This is what due to the Greeks was a traveling hat with its wide brim would protect you from the brutal summer sun in Greece. Still to this day brutal. He has wings on his sandals. Sometimes has, of course, wings on his hat as well. Not always. Very easy to recognize. And then he carries this staff, which the ancients called the caduceus. Sometimes it's a very simple one. You see this long one here. It's got a couple of snakes entwined on it. Kind of the classic one that we are more prone to recognize is this one with the snakes wrapped around the staff and the wings on it. This one, of course, is recognizable to most people, not as the staff of Hermes, but we recognize it as a medical symbol. And there's we don't fully understand how Hermes' staff becomes associated as a medical symbol. Some people think that it was that the ancient Greeks themselves, messengers, as they would cross enemy lines, to deliver a message to the enemy camp, may have carried a caduceus. And I am a human messenger, so I carry the staff of the messenger god. And carrying that staff meant you've all heard the phrase, don't shoot the messenger. They are inviolate. And so even though they're crossing enemy lines, look, I'm carrying this, I have immunity, I'm here to deliver a message, don't touch me, don't hurt me. So perhaps the symbol itself became kind of indicative of protection, guarding one's health. And then over time that makes its way over into medical imagery for similar reasons. Possibly. There are other theories around that as well. Of course, now in the mythological narratives and the stories that we read, Hermes plays that role of the messenger god. He often represents that link between the mortal world and the immortal world. So here we see him. This is a scene of the Judgment of Paris. Paris, remember, he's the guy that has the thankless task of deciding which of the goddesses he's going to give the golden apple to. The golden apple that says for the fairest or for the most beautiful inscribed on the side of it. And he gives it to Aphrodite, and that's the thing that sets the whole Trojan War in motion. But here's Hermes in the center here, you can see there's the caduceus, very kind of simple. There's the snakes at the end of it, the wings on his sandals. He really, in this sense, just kind of represents he's the connection between the realm of the goddesses over here and Paris, the mortal over here. Along with Athena, he's probably just really second to Athena. He is one of the principal helper of heroes in Greek tales, and that's one of the reasons we know a lot about Hermes, because the Greeks loved their hero tales, and so Hermes shows up a lot. So here we have a very early Greek vase painting, what we call black figure vase painting, which shows a scene from the end of the Iliad. So this is this is arguably the climax of the Iliad. It's the duel between Achilles. One of the things I love about Greek vases is that they will often label their characters. So you have Achilleus here. This tells us who this is, and he's having a duel with Hector here. That's Hector, the great Trojan warrior. And the climactic duel between the two is near the end of the Iliad. This guy down here, Troilus down here, poor sap who gets killed in the battle. And then we have Athena here. She is not labeled. Maybe she just doesn't need a label here. And then right behind her is Hermes. And so you have Hermes and Athena working together, as they often do. I mean, we see that in the Odyssey. Well, not really Athena and Hermes working together, but they are both tasked with helping Odysseus. Athena more than Hermes, but Hermes showing up on a handful of occasions in that story. Another one that we'll see later on. Hermes plays an active role in helping Perseus in severing the head of Medusa, one of the most famous hero legends. And the stories differ. In this statue group, he is wearing the cap of Hermes, which allows him to get from one place to another very, very quickly. And as I understand, most of the earliest written versions, Hermes lends him one of his sandals to get around. But again, I'm always fascinated at how visual representations often will extend the narrative and change these narratives in small but interesting ways. One kind of notable story, I just call your attention to it because it's a very un-Hermes-like story. Hermes, one of his nicknames is Hermes Argeiphontes, which in Greek literally means the slayer of Argus. And so there's this wonderful story where, wonderful, depending on your point of view, Zeus has one of his many affairs with a young woman named Io, literally spelled I-O. And again, Hera gets wind of this, and she's of course upset, as she always is. And in this case, she takes her vengeance on Io. And so what she does, she changes Io into a cow, and then sends this giant horsefly to sting the cow and chase her all over the world. Again, one of these brutally unjust stories. No matter where you slice it, Io she has no choice. She has no choice but to subsume to the demands of Zeus, and then Hera takes it all out on her. Well, eventually, Hera removes the gadfly, removes the horsefly, and then places Io basically in prison, and sets this creature, this figure here, to guard Io so she can never escape. This is Argus. And so Argus, he's the ultimate kind of watchman. He has, in most tellings, he has dozens, if not hundreds, of eyes all over his body. And the idea is that at any given point, many of his eyes are always going to be open. So he's a creature that never really sleeps, and so Io can never escape. Incidentally, Argus is also the name of Odysseus' dog, I think, which you'll see very, very soon. And so, Argus would be, it's a great name for a watchdog because it shares its name with this creature. I'm not sure that's the reason that Odysseus named his dog Argus. Argus in Greek just really means quick, swift, which is probably the more likely connection. But it's a nice kind of corollary here. So the story goes is that Zeus feels bad for Io, and he wants her to escape, even if it's in cow form. So he sends Hermes down. And the way that story usually goes is Hermes uses, this is so interesting, if you look at most visual representations of it, it's an action scene. So here we have, Hermes drawing his sword to stab Argus to death, which, again, at a glance, is a very kind of un-Hermes-like action to take. But in the written versions or the performed versions, Hermes uses his mind. He uses his metis, And so what he does, he just comes down there and he tells Argus one boring story after another. Each story more boring than the previous one, and one by one, Hermes is so boring that he puts out each of Argus's eyes and he puts him completely to sleep. And that's when he draws the sword and kills Argus. But I just find this interesting, is that to depict in visual form a god telling a boring story, that makes for a very boring image. And so the vase painters change it into kind of an action scene. Here, clearly Argus is awake, and Hermes is drawing the sword. Again, it just takes the narrative, extends it slightly. I mean, again, it may be reflective of a different version of this story, but there again we have the traditional version of the story and the visual story kind of in tension a little bit. He also, like I said, is that most depictions of Hermes is as a beardless youth, but I can note here as Hermes Argeiphontes, he's got the beard, so it's not a consistent one. But I would say by and large, Hermes depictions are as kind of the eternal teenager. And so in statuary, as kind of the Greek era goes on into the Roman era, he becomes a representative kind of ideal masculine physical perfection. So here we have, this is a famous statue group. You'll now find this in Olympia, ancient Olympia, in the museum there. But here we have Hermes with the baby Dionysus, the god of revel, the god of wine, who we'll be encountering very soon. But here again, it's not really about the story of the connection between Hermes and Dionysus. It's about showing kind of the realistic and balanced and harmonized physical perfection, masculine perfection that Hermes represents here. And again, I think I've mentioned it earlier too. But again, the masculine gods and masculine heroes are very often depicted in the nude. And here too, I don't think the main point was to sexualize it, was to eroticize it. I don't think that was the primary goal of something like this. But we know of this connection. We talked about, like, with Olympic athletes competing in the nude. It wasn't meant to be erotic. It wasn't meant to be sexual. It was that nudity and that physical, almost geometric perfection of the body was thought to be divine. And so the nudity, the masculine nudity, was indicative of divinity, rather than it be kind of erotic or pornographic. Like I mentioned on the first slide, one of the extensions of Hermes' role as the messenger god, he's what they call the psychopomp. Psyche in Greek means soul. Pomp or pompos, guide, soul guide. And so he can traverse that boundary between this world and the underworld. And so we know that lots of funerary rites were conducted in the name of Hermes. You wanted, as bleak as their view of the underworld might be, as we looked at earlier, it was infinitely worse for your loved one to be stuck between this world and the next. And so that's why these funerary rituals were so important. And I think I showed you a version of this vase before. So here it's a funerary vase where we have Hermes, clearly Hermes here, right? And he's guiding the soul of this dead woman, probably the woman whose grave this vase marked, into the boat of Charon, the ferryman who will take her into the underworld. Here's another one where we have another funerary vase, survives very well. Here we have this woman who seems to be getting dressed. She's arranging kind of this crown on her head and her robe. And then over on a rock here we have Hermes, a very simple Hermes, but the one thing that gives it away is that little catechaeus in his hand. And he's a bearded Hermes, note. He's pointing at her, and the idea is that he seems to be instructing her. This is how you dress, this is the ritual, this is how you prepare for that final journey. He's the psychopomp, showing the way. Here's another a very famous vase called the Euphronius crater. A crater is just a big mixing bowl where the Greeks would have mixed their wine. And here we have a scene from the Iliad. This is a figure, a warrior in the Iliad by the name of Sarpedon. He's actually a mortal son of Zeus that is killed on the battlefield. And at the moment of his death, we have Hermes, the psychopomp, show up to guide the shade of Sarpedon down to his place in the underworld. And he is assisted here, this is interesting, by two helpers here. On the left we here have Thanatos, which is just the Greek word for death. And over here we have Hypnos, which is the Greek word for sleep. Sleep being kind of the closest that a human being can get to death, so to speak, without actually dying. And so Thanatos and Hypnos, death and sleep, are the assistants of Hermes, the psychopomp. You can even see their wings here. They almost kind of appear as kind of angelic figures who are carrying out the wishes of Hermes. There again, there you see the caduceus on his shoulder, giving away the identity of Hermes. Also, like I mentioned earlier, when the Romans get their hand on Hermes, they called him Mercury. And even in that name, you can see kind of our word in English, like merchant, mercantile. The Latin word merx, M-E-R-X, was the name, the Latin word for profit. And so the Romans kind of extended this aspect of Hermes. The Greeks didn't really worship Hermes along those lines, but he changes his guise slightly when he comes into the Roman pantheon. And so the Mercury, while he played all of those roles that we just talked about, messenger deity, funerary deity, god of liminal spaces for the Romans as well, you find a lot of those Hermes with the phallus and the like in Italy as well as Greece. They also, you might have a statue or a symbol of Hermes in your place of business in the marketplace too, as a god who would increase your mercs, increase your profit. And then just briefly, to wrap it up here, Hermes kind of after the Greek moment, after kind of the Roman empire kind of collapses and crumbles as we get into what we call the medieval era. Hermes kind of role as a god of magic kind of takes on this broad role, and he's mentioned in some of these early medieval or late Roman spell books that survive in Egypt, which to the ancient Greeks and Romans was always kind of a mystical land of magic. We still have kind of that kind of romantic view of Egypt as this deeply mysterious place. So it was the same for the Greeks and the Romans as well. And so Egypt became a cradle of magical practice and magical thinking. And there Hermes was known as Hermes Trismegistus, literally Hermes the triple great, the 3 times great one. And was the premier connection between the mortal world and the divine world. Here's a woodcut engraving illustration from one of these alchemical magical texts, which shows Hermes Trismegistus as the link between. You can see he's literally kind of spinning the globe in his hand on his finger. He's got the kind of the whole world in his hands, so to speak. And lots of these other images, these other symbols for other powers and gods are kind of at his side and at his feet. He's kind of elevated as a supreme deity. The only thing above him up here in the sky it's a Greek up here, it says theos, which is just the word for God. So he's the connection between mortality and deity. And so he has a long afterlife, from the Greek moment into the Roman moment and beyond. And lots of these things kind of manifest themselves as kind of extensions of his core classical Greek identity. All right, that's all I got for you on Hermes. Talk to you soon.